You might think a 24.5-inch Full HD 240Hz TN panel might be quite cheap in modern day technology. Well, that's not quite the case, because the BenQ Zowie XL2546K comes in at a whopping £480, and if you're in the US it's around $450. That's a lot of money to spend. Now in this review we're going to be seeing if it's actually worth it, and the links in the description below will take you to your relevant Amazon stores. Also down there you'll find some alternative monitors that you might want to consider, and this is coming from someone who has reviewed in excess of 180 monitors and has shoved over 2,000 hours in competitive Counter-Strike. Now before getting into my detailed review, if you do have Instagram or Twitter, I'd very much appreciate a follow, and if you're interested in keeping up with the latest news or reviews of electric or hybrid vehicles, do check out Totally EV, your support would be equally appreciated. So jumping straight into it, let's get into the build quality and design. And here I think the BenQ monitor is decent. By decent I mean the adjustments that you get with the stand are very versatile. You've got height, tilt, pivot and fully rotation adjustments that you can have. And you also do get these side panels which sit on the side of the monitor, and that means that you can be a little less distracted from the environment around you. I don't think it's a night and day difference, but for those people who want to use it or indeed find it useful, well, it's included in the box, and of course you can remove them if you so wish. Oddly, also BenQ add a kind of cover that sits on top of the monitor. I think this is mainly for, let's say, eSports tournaments, whereby you don't want too much dust to be settling on them, but I can't see how it's going to be useful for consumers out there. Now, as for the monitor's build quality, the reason I'm not too impressed by it is because it doesn't quite have a 3-sided or 4-sided borderless design. It does remind me of a monitor from yesteryear, and it's got relatively chunky bezels, not as big as some of BenQ's previous monitors, but still pretty large for a modern day monitor that's built in 2021. Now nevertheless, the design of the monitor isn't overly bad, and I actually do like the fact that there is a headphone stand fan at the back of the monitor as well. Now in terms of display inputs, you've got 3 HDMI 2.0 ports and a singular display 1.2 port. This is going to suffice for outputting 1080p at 240 Hz. Furthermore, you've got a 3.5mm jack output for your headphones if you so wish to connect it directly to the monitor itself. I would always suggest a DAC or, let's say, bookshelf speakers. Specifically if you're going to be a competitive gamer, you probably have either a headset or some sort of headphone setup. I should mention that this doesn't have any built-in monitor speakers. Now elsewhere, I like the fact that BenQ have included a wired puck, which is very useful for accessing the OSD or indeed flicking between your 3 preset modes that you might have set indeed via the menu. So now we get onto the OSD, and as I mentioned before, you can use the little puck in order to access it. So that's exactly what I'm doing over here. Now in terms of mode, I actually chose movie because I felt that that gave the best sort of color reproduction. Of course your mileage may vary. As for the color, I've got black equalizer at 10, color vibrance at 10, low blue light at 0, of course you can adjust that, and a gamma at 5. It comes by default by 3, but I felt that 5 gave a little bit more punch. As for the color temperature, I've left it to normal. You can go on user define if you so wish as well and adjust the RGB gain, and then you've got a color weakness. In other words, you've got a little filter if you want to use it. Now going back, you've then got the picture mode. Now the DYAC Plus, I've got a premium, and we'll touch upon this in just a bit. It does affect the overall brightness, and yes, the brightness I've got at 0 just for the camera to pick it up properly. And again, we're going to talk about AMA further down in this review. Now you can save your settings to one of the profiles, so in terms of gamer 1, 2 or 3, and then in terms of display, that's to do with the display modes and the inputs. Then you can also customize the rotation keys as to what they do, and that's quite nice to see. And then you've got the system. Now you can see the FreeSync mode is actually disabled and it's kind of grayed out. Now that's because we've got the DYAC Plus setting enabled. So yes, if you have that enabled, you can't enable or even disable FreeSync Premium. It just gets completely blanked out. So if you do want to use FreeSync, then you can't use DYAC Plus. Now in terms of headphone, you can adjust the volume. That's via the 3.5mm jack. It doesn't have any built-in speakers. You've got the OSD settings, a bit of information as to resolution, and you've got the other settings over here. You can also have a buzzer, but I personally don't like its inclusion, it's quite distracting, but I can understand why people would want it, specifically if you've got your headphones on. So now we get on to image quality. Now the monitor doesn't have a dedicated sRGB mode, but to my eyes I was able to set it through the OSD as you would have seen before via the movie mode and the normal tone, and therefore allowed me to just test it against the sRGB standard. Now here it hits 96.6% of the gamut coverage and 110.6% of the gamut volume. You'll be able to see over here that it extends in terms of the warmer tones, but seems to lack a little bit in the colder, or say greener tones. Now in terms of its sRGB color accuracy, this is out of the box performance. You get an average LTE of 3.57 and a maximum of 6.87, with a contrast ratio which is relatively respectable for a TN panel at 825:1. Now why should you care about the color accuracy? Well, if you're a gamer, you really shouldn't care too much about it. But if you're someone who's going to be using this for, let's say, picture editing or let's say video grading, then this monitor will definitely not be for you. It probably wasn't for you in the first place. I don't know why you might have been considering it, but if you're someone who is, let's say, going to be editing photos and also consider themselves as a hardcore competitive gamer, then, well, this monitor isn't for you. Furthermore, the viewing angles are not that great. There's a little bit of color shift if you slightly move your head off the center of the monitor. What I'm trying to say over here is a TN panel is very much like its older predecessors. It is still effectively a TN panel and therefore won't deliver you, let's say, eye-popping colors. Now, regardless of what you use the monitor for, the overall brightness will be of importance, and here the monitor hits 323 nits in terms of peak brightness, and in terms of its minimum brightness it gets to 46 nits. Now if you were to enable DYAC+, this will limit its peak brightness at 308 nits. All these figures are perfectly fine. If you're going to be in a very bright sunlit room, you might want to look for a monitor that exceeds that figure, but I think most people will be sitting at around 250 to 300 nits, at which point all the color modes, or should I say all the modes that you can use this monitor in, specifically when it comes to hardcore competitive gaming, will perfectly suffice. Now, one of the key advantages of having a TN panel is that the overall brightness uniformity and backlight bleed are pretty good, specifically for a gaming grade monitor. You'll be able to see on your screen as to how the monitor performs, and in comparison to a comparable IPS or let's say VA panel, a TN panel will definitely come out on top in this domain. Now, while image quality is important, specifically for those people who are like myself who use their monitor for day-to-day usage and indeed use it for gaming, it's not going to be as important for those hardcore competitive gamers out there who just want, let's say, the fastest, lowest input lag and highest refresh rate monitor that is available out there. Now, before jumping into hardcore competitive gaming, in other words Counter-Strike, I do have to mention in terms of AMD FreeSync and G-Sync. Now, while I don't have an AMD graphics card, I have got an NVIDIA RTX 2080 Super, and connected over DisplayPort, I actually noticed that G-Sync wouldn't really work. Now, this happened when I had the monitor set to 240 Hz. When I dropped it down to 144 Hz, it seemed to have worked and G-Sync was then in operation. Frankly, I'm not really sure why you'd enable G-Sync or FreeSync on a competitive gaming monitor like this one, but nevertheless it's something I thought to point out. When I searched the internet, I saw some other people that reported the same sort of flickering and problems that I had, and in this respect they had to set a custom resolution, in other words via CRU, and therefore allowed you to have a different VRR range, and therefore meant that you didn't have these kind of flickering problems. Again, I can't speak for AMD users. For NVIDIA users, however, if you're going to use NVIDIA G-Sync via AMD FreeSync, you might want to consider setting your own custom resolution, or indeed just dropping down the overall refresh rate of the monitor down to 144 Hz. Now, with that in mind, if you do want to use AMD FreeSync, as I mentioned before in the OSD section, it means that you can't use the DYAC+ function. So it's kind of a trade-off. If you're a competitive gamer, you're gonna have to disable AMD FreeSync in order to utilize the DYAC+ function. And in this respect, this is what I always do. No matter the type of monitor, when it comes to competitive gaming, I don't want my frames to be capped. I don't mind a little bit of tearing, specifically in a game that looks like a bit of like a potato, like Counter-Strike. Even in games like Valorant, for example, I think you will prefer to have as many frames as you can rather than capping it at, let's say, 240 Hz. Now, in terms of competitive gaming, I must say that it does really well. It's almost no surprise here that we're talking about a TN panel. The overall response time of the monitor is very good. with DYAC Plus enabled in terms of its maximum mode, in other words premium, and AMA enabled with premium mode enabled as well, there was very little inverse ghosting. It's not to say that it was completely non-existent, there was some little inverse ghosting, but it's perfectly playable in a game like Counter-Strike or even like Valorant. If you were to play a lot more graphically intense games such as, let's say, Destiny 2, then you might want to consider dialing down the AMA to one notch, in other words, not to get as the fastest response time, but as a trade-off in order not to get that sort of purple trailing effect. Now, as for input lag, again, it was extremely impressive. It just responded exactly as I would expect and had no sort of problem. Now, in terms of my overall performance with the monitor, while I was in just a deathmatch playing Counter-Strike at the middle of the day and just trying to see how it would compare to my experiences of playing on other 240Hz or 144Hz monitors, I just found that my performance was actually pretty poor. And the reason behind that is because the TN panel just really didn't seem to suit with my eyes, even though the monitor was perfectly responsive and had a fantastically low input lag. What I'm trying to say over here is that the monitor is great in terms of its competitive gaming credentials. Is it a monitor that you should consider? Well, that's for you to make that decision. And frankly, this really leads me on to my verdict. And where the BenQ really had to perform was in terms of its competitive gaming. Here, BenQ have ticked that box in a major way. In other words, the input lag and response time are fantastic, and the overall refresh rate that you get means that you're going to get less tearing, and indeed you get a little bit more of a buttery smooth experience if you're playing a hardcore competitive game such as Counter-Strike or Valorant or other. The issue, however, is one, the asking price. It's too much money for a full HD TN panel at 240Hz. I would expect to be paying half the price of what BenQ are actually asking for. Now, if you forget about the overall cost of the monitor and you look at other solutions out there, you can get a 1440p or full HD IPS panel that runs at 240Hz or above. So for example, 280Hz on the Asus panel that I'm thinking of, and it'll be linked down in the description below, by the way. And that will give you an excellent responsive feel when it comes to gaming, but then means that you don't have to tear your eyes out each time you switch on the monitor because you're treated with a TN panel instead. And quite frankly, that is my honest opinion and suggestions to you guys. That is just my suggestion and my opinion. You might of course agree or disagree with me, so do let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, give it a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification if you want to keep up with the channel, and favourite and share if you feel that this video will be helpful to a family and friend making an informed purchasing decision. Alright, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care of yourselves and goodbye.